You flip a switch and the light comes on. Costs you a fraction of a cent. That single, boring, instant moment is the end product of one of the most expensive machines humans have ever built. A machine so large it touches almost every building in the country, runs almost entirely on infrastructure most people have never seen, and somehow has to work perfectly every second or people die. Here's the number that should stop you. Keeping that machine running and modernizing it for the next 5 years alone is expected to cost American utilities more than $1.1 trillion. Not over a decade. Over 5 years. So why does something as simple as electricity require spending on a scale usually reserved for wars and moon landings? And why, despite all that money, do the lights still go out? Let's start with what the power grid actually is. It's not one thing. It's 3 separate systems stitched together: generation, the power plants, wind farms, solar arrays, and nuclear reactors that actually create electricity; transmission, the network of high-voltage lines that move that electricity over long distances, often hundreds of miles, from where it's made to where it's needed; and distribution, the lower-voltage local wires that finally deliver it to your house, your office, or the hospital down the street in the United States. This entire system is run by a patchwork of over 3,000 utilities, some investor-owned and publicly traded, some owned by cities and municipalities, and some structured as member-owned cooperatives, all operating under the oversight of state regulators and, for anything crossing state lines, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. There's another challenge that makes the power grid unlike almost any other business. Electricity has to be produced at almost exactly the same moment it's consumed. If supply suddenly falls short of demand, or demand unexpectedly drops below supply, the grid's frequency begins to drift, equipment can automatically shut down, and small problems can quickly cascade into large-scale outages. That means grid operators are constantly balancing supply and demand, second by second, making electricity one of the few products that has to be manufactured and delivered almost instantly. Why does it exist in this fragmented, heavily regulated form instead of one single national provider? Because, like a water system, the wires running to your house are a natural monopoly. It would be wildly inefficient to have 3 different companies stringing 3 different sets of power lines down your street to compete for your business. So regulators allow a single utility to operate as a monopoly in a given territory, and in exchange, that utility accepts strict oversight over what it can charge and how much profit it can earn. This isn't a niche industry either. It's genuinely one of the largest capital markets in the country, with investor-owned utilities spending a record $208 billion in 2025 alone, and Edison Electric Institute projecting over $1.1 trillion in cumulative grid investment through 2029. So what does it actually take to build and own a piece of this system? Building a single large power plant, whether it's natural gas, nuclear, or a utility-scale solar farm, can cost anywhere from several hundred million to tens of billions of dollars, depending on the technology, with nuclear plants sitting at the extreme high end due to their complexity and safety requirements. But generation is often the smaller half of the story. Transmission and distribution infrastructure, the actual wires, substations, and transformers that move power around, frequently costs more in aggregate than the plants themselves, especially now. A single mile of new high-voltage transmission line can run into the millions of dollars, and building it requires navigating land rights, environmental review, and local permitting processes that can take years, sometimes can take years before construction even begins. But power lines are only the visible part of the grid. Hidden behind fences and inside metal cabinets are thousands of substations, transformers, protective relays, sensors, and control systems quietly keeping electricity flowing every second. Every one of those assets has to be built, maintained, upgraded, and eventually replaced, turning what looks like a network of wires into one of the largest infrastructure systems on Earth. And before many of these projects can even begin, utilities must navigate years of regulatory approvals, environmental reviews, and permitting processes that often take longer than the construction itself. So after hearing all of that, you might assume power companies must be making enormous profits. After all, they're legal monopolies selling something every American depends on every single day. Surprisingly, the answer is both yes and no, and understanding why reveals one of the strangest business models in the entire economy. By this point, the power grid starts looking less like a collection of wires and more like a living machine that never gets to sleep. Every mile of cable, every transformer, and every substation has to work together every second of every day. And keeping that machine alive is where the real money begins. Now, how does this enormous, capital-hungry system actually make money? The obvious revenue stream is straightforward. Customers pay for electricity based on how much they consume, measured in kilowatt hours, plus a fixed monthly connection charge that covers the cost of simply being hooked up to the grid regardless of usage. But for regulated, investor-owned utilities, there's a far more important mechanism operating underneath that simple bill: something most customers have never heard of called the rate base. Think of it this way. Unlike Apple or Walmart, a utility doesn't become more profitable by convincing people to buy more electricity. Instead, it becomes more profitable by convincing regulators that investing billions into safer, stronger infrastructure is worth paying for. Regulators allow utilities to earn a guaranteed rate of return, often in the range of 9 to 10%, on the value of the infrastructure they've built, the power plants, transmission lines, and substations. This means a utility's profit is tied directly to how much capital infrastructure it owns and how efficiently it can justify that spending to regulators, not simply to how much power it sells. In fact, in mature markets where electricity demand has flattened, building new infrastructure, upgrading substations, hardening lines against storms, or building new transmission for renewable energy has become one of the most reliable ways for a utility to grow earnings, because every dollar spent on approved capital projects becomes a dollar the utility can earn a guaranteed return on for decades. There's also a rapidly growing hidden revenue stream reshaping the entire industry right now: data centers. Explosive growth in artificial intelligence computing has sent electricity demand from data centers skyrocketing, with a single hyperscale facility sometimes requiring as much power as 80,000 to 160,000 homes combined. Utilities in regions with heavy data center development are securing massive, long-term supply contracts with technology companies, often at premium rates, turning what used to be a slow-growing, low-margin business into one of the fastest-growing corners of the entire utility sector. But here's the part most customers never see. When utilities spend billions replacing transmission lines, upgrading substations, or expanding the grid, that money usually isn't absorbed by the company itself. Instead, utilities submit those projects to regulators, who decide whether the costs can be recovered through future electricity bills. In other words, every monthly power bill isn't just paying for the electricity you use today. It's also helping finance infrastructure that's expected to keep the grid running for decades. Running all of this, though, comes with expenses that never really stop. Fuel costs for natural gas, coal, or nuclear plants fluctuate with global commodity markets and get passed through to customers in ways that can spike bills overnight. Grid maintenance is relentless. Transformers fail, transmission towers corrode, and vegetation has to be constantly cleared away from power lines to prevent exactly the kind of contact that starts wildfires. Skilled labor, line workers, engineers, and control room operators command strong wages because the job requires years of training and because outages have to be repaired regardless of weather, time of day, or holiday. And then there's the cost that's exploding faster than almost any other line item on a utility's budget: climate resilience. Hardening infrastructure against increasingly severe storms, floods, heat waves, and wildfires has become an enormous and largely unavoidable expense, one that didn't really exist as a major budget category a generation ago. This is where the grid's economics can turn from expensive into catastrophic, because unlike almost any other capital-intensive business, a power utility's core physical asset, the wire itself, can become the direct cause of a multi-billion-dollar disaster. Consider Pacific Gas and Electric, California's largest utility. In 2017 and 2018, aging equipment owned by the company sparked a series of wildfires across Northern California, including the Camp Fire, the deadliest and most destructive wildfire in state history, which alone caused more than 80 deaths. It eventually agreed to a settlement of roughly $25.5 billion to compensate wildfire victims, insurers, and local governments, and committed to spending billions more hardening its grid against future fires. PG&E's collapse is a stark illustration of a core truth in this industry. Because utilities are legally on the hook for damage their equipment causes, deferred maintenance isn't just an operational risk, it's an existential financial one. Then there's a different kind of failure entirely: the Texas power crisis of February 2021, when Winter Storm Uri knocked out roughly half the state's generating capacity as natural gas wellheads, pipelines, and even some wind turbines froze in temperatures the system simply wasn't built to handle. Because Texas operates its own largely isolated grid, run by the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, with minimal connections to neighboring states, the system had almost no ability to import emergency power when its own generation failed. Millions of Texans lost power for days in freezing temperatures, and the disaster was linked to hundreds of deaths. It wasn't a failure of capital investment in the way PG&E's crisis was. It was a failure of planning for an extreme event the system's operators had judged too unlikely to justify the cost of preparing for, a gamble that turned out to be devastatingly wrong. Both cases point to the same underlying tension. Utilities are regulated to keep prices as low as politically possible, which creates constant pressure to defer expensive, less visible investments like grid hardening, weatherization, and vegetation management in favor of spending that's easier to justify to regulators and the public. That tension between short-term affordability and long-term resilience sits at the center of almost every major grid failure of the last decade. Looking ahead, the pressures on this system are only intensifying. The rise of renewable energy, now a significant and growing share of new generation capacity nationwide, creates a genuinely new engineering problem. Solar and wind don't produce power on demand the way a natural gas plant does, which means grid operators need massive investment in battery storage and much more flexible transmission networks capable of moving power from sunny or windy regions to wherever demand happens to be at that moment. The Department of Energy has concluded that regional transmission capacity needs to roughly double by 2035, with even larger increases required for the connections between regions. At the same time, artificial intelligence is being deployed by grid operators themselves, used to predict equipment failures before they happen, optimize power flow in real time, and manage the increasingly complex balancing act of a grid that now has to absorb power flowing in from millions of individual rooftop solar panels and electric vehicle batteries, not just a handful of centralized power plants. Electrification of vehicles, heating, and industry is also driving the first sustained surge in electricity demand the country has seen in decades, reversing a long stretch of flat consumption and forcing utilities to plan for growth again after years of managing mostly for maintenance. So here is the honest answer to what it really costs to run a power grid, and why. The grid succeeds financially and physically when utilities are allowed to invest steadily and transparently in the unglamorous parts of the system, hardened lines, upgraded substations, redundant transmission paths, before those weaknesses turn into disasters, and when regulators strike a workable balance between keeping bills affordable today and funding the resilience that prevents catastrophic costs tomorrow. It fails, sometimes fatally, when either side of that balance is neglected for too long, when maintenance is deferred to protect short-term rates, or when planning assumes the last worst-case scenario will also be the next one. The electricity you use is priced by the kilowatt-hour, but the real product a utility is selling isn't power. It's the promise that an almost incomprehensibly complex machine, spanning thousands of miles and running around the clock, won't fail you when you need it most. Every dollar spent maintaining that promise is invisible, right up until the moment it isn't.